The sterile, white-lit corridors of the tyrant's hand were as cold and unyielding as the Zorati themselves. Hilera Vasquez, a human nurse on an alien warship, walked with a steady pace, her footsteps echoing softly against the polished floors. She kept her head low, the familiar weight of the stairs from passing Zorati nobles pressing down on her, an unspoken reminder of her place. Her uniform, simple and functional, contrasted starkly with the opulence that surrounded her, luxurious fabrics, jewels, and the sleek, gleaming technology of a species that had long since forgotten humility. Despite the grandeur of the ship and its aristocratic inhabitants, Hilera had learned to navigate this world with quiet grace. Her role as a nurse aboard the ship was both a blessing and a curse. The Zorati, though highly advanced and immensely powerful, had a rather peculiar relationship with humans. They viewed them as primitive, inconsequential beings, incapable of achieving the greatness they themselves possessed. This was not lost on Hilera. She was no fool. Every word, every glance from a Zorati noble was a constant reminder of her station in life, a mere servant to their grandeur. Today, her shift had been long, stretching for hours as she moved from patient to patient, attending to the wounded and the ill without question. In the high-tech medical bay of the tyrant's hand, her skills were valued for one reason, the efficiency with which she could heal. The Zorati didn't care for her humanity, nor did they care about her past, they only cared that she could stop their precious aristocrats from dying. As Hilera entered the medical ward, she was met with a familiar scene, a Zorati noble, sprawled on the operating table, the grotesque slashes across their chest oozing thick blue blood. The alien's golden eyes stared up at her with indifference, their regal features unmoving. She had seen it all before. "Another accident, Lady Lyra?" Hilera asked, her voice calm as she prepped the necessary instruments, not even waiting for an answer. She had learned to speak with such precision over the years, a method to keep her emotions out of her voice. Lady Lyra, a high-ranking Zorati aristocrat, smirked, her lips curling into an almost imperceptible sneer. "It seems your kind is better at healing than at ruling," she remarked, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Hilera chose to ignore the comment, focusing on the task at hand. She inserted the needle with practiced ease, injecting a serum into the alien's bloodstream. As she worked, her mind wandered briefly. These nobles, they never learned humility. It was always the same, they came to her for help, but never once did they offer respect in return. They simply demanded. The thought was interrupted by the sharp, metallic hiss of the door sliding open. Hilera didn't need to turn to know who had entered. The cold presence of Queen Vasquez filled the room, an overwhelming force of arrogance that preceded her. Her every step was calculated, her eyes burning with the smug assurance of someone who knew they were untouchable. "Ah, the human nurse," Vasquez's voice rang out, a mocking lilt woven into her words. "Still playing doctor to the weak, I see." Hilera's hands froze for a brief moment, her fingers brushing against the instrument tray. She didn't look up, not even as the queen moved closer, her presence like a storm cloud ready to burst. "I wonder," Vasquez continued, circling the table like a predator inspecting her prey, "how long will it take for you to realize your place among us, human? A nurse, a lowly servant. You are no more than a tool, a piece of machinery for our convenience." Hilera felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Stay calm," she reminded herself. "Just finish the job." Her gaze remained fixed on Lady Lyra, who seemed oblivious to the exchange between the two women. Vasquez's laughter, sharp and condescending, cut through the air. "You think you matter, don't you? A mere human, tending to the mighty Zorati. You're nothing." For a brief moment, Hilera's breath caught in her throat. The words stung, not because they were true, but because they reminded her of a reality she couldn't escape. Her entire existence had been reduced to this, a servant to those who saw her species as nothing more than a footnote in the history of the galaxy. But then, something shifted within her. The flash of anger that flickered in her chest was fleeting, but it was enough to change the course of her thoughts. She couldn't allow this. She couldn't allow this creature to speak to her as though she were nothing. Without looking up, Hilera's voice remained steady, colder than before. I may be a nurse, your majesty, but at least I do something useful. The silence that followed was thick, as though the words had settled heavily between them. Veskira's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something other than contempt in her gaze. She studied Elara for a long moment, as if weighing her worth. Then, she smirked. You amuse me, human, Veskira said, her voice laced with venom. But make no mistake, you are beneath me. Beneath all of us. Elara felt the weight of the queen's words press down on her, but she refused to let them crush her spirit. She would not break. With a sharp nod, Veskira turned on her heel and left the room, the hiss of the door closing behind her signaling her departure. The moment the queen was gone, the tension in the room dissipated, and Elara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands continued their work, a quiet rhythm of healing in the midst of the chaos. She could feel the sting of Veskira's words lingering, but there was something else beneath it, a spark, small and fleeting, but undeniable. Something in her wanted to rise, to push back against the cruelty of this empire. As the medical ward quieted, Elara allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. The Zorati may have ruled the stars, but she had the power to save their lives. And for now, that was enough. But deep down, Elara knew it wouldn't always be. One day, the galaxy would learn that a human could be more than just a servant. They would learn the price of underestimating humanity. And Elara Vasquez would be the one to make them learn. The days blurred together for Elara. The monotony of tending to the Zorati nobles, their endless demands, their dismissive attitudes, they were all the same. But something was changing within her. It began with the dreams. She had never been one for superstition or visions, but the dreams felt real. Night after night, they came, fragments of royal halls, ancient symbols, and battles fought in the stars. At first, Elara dismissed them as stress-induced nightmares. It had been a tough week, her shifts had been longer than usual, and the stress of dealing with the Zorati had been more oppressive than ever. But these dreams weren't like the usual restless nights. There was a vividness to them, an unmistakable sense of familiarity. She woke up from them drenched in cold sweat, her heart pounding, as if the images had touched something deep within her that she didn't understand. But the dreams didn't stop. They began to haunt her waking moments. During the day, she would find herself staring at her reflection in the polished walls of the tyrant's hand, a strange feeling creeping over her as if she didn't recognize the face staring back. The woman in the mirror was familiar yet foreign. The face was hers, but something else, a history, a weight, seemed to lie behind her eyes, just out of reach. It all came to a head one morning, as she walked to the medical bay, the usual hum of the ship's machinery echoing through the long corridors. Elara had just finished her shift in the lower decks, attending to the injured soldiers of the Zorati army who, for all their advanced technology, were prone to getting themselves into dangerous situations. As usual, her mind was focused on the task at hand, ready to face another demanding round of treatments. But this time, there was something different in the air. A flicker of heat moved through her chest, spreading to her limbs, and a sudden wave of dizziness nearly sent her crashing into the wall. She steadied herself, her hand gripping the edge of the nearest corridor's arch. It was brief, but something felt wrong. Or maybe, more accurately, something felt right in a way she couldn't explain. She blinked, trying to shake off the feeling, but as she stepped into the medical bay, it struck her again, stronger this time. The room felt smaller. The instruments on the counters seemed to shimmer with an unnatural glow. A strange hum resonated deep within her, a deep-seated vibration that made her skin tingle. She gripped the counter to steady herself, her breath quickening as her heart raced. "You look pale, Nurse Vasquez," a familiar voice drawled from behind her. It was Lady Lyra, her usual condescending tone dripping with disdain. Elara forced herself to compose, turning around with a tight smile. "Just a little tired," she replied, though she could feel the lie hanging in the air. Lyra's cold eyes swept over her, clearly unconvinced. "A weak human, unable to bear even a simple shift," she muttered under her breath. Then, with a dismissive wave, she added, "At least you're good for something." Elara bit her tongue. Every insult felt like an attack, but this time, her patience began to wear thin. She didn't respond, just focused on the task of prepping the medical equipment. But as she moved, the strange sensation within her grew, a low, thrumming pulse in her chest, as if something was awakening. The moment Alara started the treatment on Lady Lyra's latest injury, it hit her. A pulse of warmth. Power. The kind of power that should not be hers. It surged through her fingertips as she applied the healing gel to Lyra's wound, the alien's skin rippling and healing under her touch in an almost unnatural speed. Alara's heart thudded in her chest as the feeling intensified. The air around her shimmered, the hum growing louder, and suddenly, she felt a pull that had always been there, buried beneath the surface, but now it was impossible to ignore. What is this?" she whispered under her breath, her eyes wide as she looked down at her hands. The power seemed to surge through her veins like wildfire. Her body was vibrating with an unfamiliar energy, and she could no longer deny it. This was not just a coincidence. This was something else entirely. She turned quickly to Lady Lyra, but the aristocrat was oblivious, her focus on the pain she was experiencing. Alara's pulse quickened as she realized what she was feeling wasn't just her imagination. This wasn't some mystical force, this was power, raw and untapped, waiting to be unleashed. Without thinking, her hands moved over Lyra's wounds with more precision, the healing process accelerating before her eyes. Lyra's body convulsed, the once ragged injuries now sealed and restored as if they had never existed. For a split second, Alara thought she saw the faintest flicker of shock in Lady Lyra's eyes as she sat up and gazed at her newly healed body, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. The noblewoman merely blinked and nodded in approval. "Impressive," Lyra muttered, though her words felt hollow to Alara, as if they were merely a formal response. But Alara didn't hear them. Her mind was still reeling, her heart pounding in her chest as the weight of what had just happened settled over her. Something's wrong with me," Alara muttered to herself, her voice trembling. She had always been good with her hands, skilled in medicine, but this was beyond anything she had ever experienced. It was as if her very essence had shifted, as if her body had unlocked something it shouldn't have known. She had to get away. Alara excused herself quickly, her face flushed, and moved toward the small medical quarters just down the hall. There, she shut herself in, the hum of the ship's machinery now deafening in her ears. She pressed her palms against the cool metal walls, trying to steady herself, but the sensation of power wouldn't fade. It swirled within her, a presence she couldn't deny. The dreams, the strange power, the feeling of being more, it all began to click into place. There was something buried deep within her that she couldn't explain. Something ancient, something powerful. As she sank to her knees in the quiet of the small room, the truth began to settle within her. She was not just a nurse. She was someone who had been hidden, forgotten by the galaxy, and now, the time was coming when she would remember who she truly was. And the Zorati would learn that even a human could be something more than they ever imagined. Alara stood at the edge of the observation deck, staring out into the void of space. The stars stretched infinitely before her, vast and unyielding, much like the empire she now found herself entangled in. The feeling of power that had surged through her the day before hadn't faded. It hadn't dissipated or settled back into the shadows of her subconscious. No, it had only grown stronger. Every pulse of that strange energy seemed to reverberate through her very soul, pushing her forward. There were flashes, images of a time long past, of thrones and armies, of a galaxy ruled by her bloodline. The more she tried to dismiss it, the more real it became. It was undeniable now. The truth was sinking in with a weight she could not escape. Alara. The voice sliced through her thoughts like a knife. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Queen Veskira's presence filled the space, as heavy and unyielding as always. Her voice was sharp, regal, carrying the unmistakable arrogance of someone who believed themselves untouchable. "You're quite fond of staring into the abyss, aren't you?" Veskira's eyes narrowed as she stepped forward, her gaze sweeping over Alara, as if she were a mere insect to be inspected. "It suits you. Though, I fail to see how it brings any value to your position." Elara didn't respond. She couldn't find the words. She was no longer the woman she had been when she first arrived on the tyrant's hand, the simple nurse content to stay in the shadows. Something inside her was awakening, something far greater than the queen could ever comprehend. "You are wasting your potential," Veskira continued, her voice cold with condescension. "But then again, I suppose that's what humans do best, isn't it? Waste their lives pretending they have a purpose beyond servitude." The sting of those words should have hurt, but it didn't. Instead, they fueled the growing fire within her. She turned slowly, meeting the queen's gaze for the first time in days, her own eyes no longer filled with the submissive uncertainty they once had. "I'm not your servant anymore, Your Majesty," Elara said, her voice firm, though the words themselves felt like they had been drawn from somewhere deep within her, from a place that had been locked away for far too long. Veskira's laughter echoed in the room, cruel and unamused. "You are nothing but a human, Elara. You're beneath me, beneath all of us. You're nothing without the empire that so graciously allows you to exist." Elara stepped forward, her heart pounding with an unfamiliar confidence. "You are wrong." The words were simple, but they rang out with such conviction that Veskira's smug expression faltered, if only for a moment. Elara could feel the power within her coil, ready to break free, but she kept it contained, for now. She wasn't going to reveal everything just yet. Not while she was still uncertain of the full scope of what she could do. "You think you can threaten me?" Veskira sneered, stepping closer, her eyes now narrowing with disdain. "Do you think you could ever rise against me, a queen of the Zorati?" Elara didn't flinch. "I don't need to threaten you, Your Majesty," she said, her voice still calm, but there was a steel edge beneath it now. "I am not afraid of you." The queen's eyes glinted with malice, and she raised her hand, her fingers sparking with the crackling energy of the Zorati's advanced technology. "You should be." With a swift motion, she thrust her hand toward Elara, the power crackling in the air between them. Elara felt the shockwave of energy, the force of it pushing against her chest. But as it made contact with her, something shifted within her. Instead of being knocked back by the surge, she stood her ground. Her skin tingled, her senses sharpened, and the energy, which would have sent most beings sprawling, seemed to dissipate into nothing. Veskira's eyes widened, her arrogance faltering for the first time. Elara could see it, the shock, the fear she had never thought the queen capable of feeling. "You," Veskira began, her voice now laced with disbelief. "How?" Elara didn't wait for her to finish. She raised her hand, and the energy that had been pooling inside her surged outward. The air crackled, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to bend under the force of the energy. The walls vibrated, the lights flickered, and Elara felt the power in her chest, coursing through her, as if she were tapping into something ancient, something primal. Veskira staggered back, her eyes wide with realization. "What is this?" "You." But Elara was no longer listening. The visions, the flashes of her heritage, had all come to a head in this moment. She wasn't just some lowly nurse. She wasn't some helpless human under the rule of the Zorati. She was the last heir to a long-forgotten royal bloodline, the rightful ruler of a galactic empire that had been wiped out by the Zorati centuries ago. Her fingers tightened, and with a wave of her hand, a bolt of energy erupted from her palm, striking the wall behind the queen. The impact sent a shockwave through the room, shaking the very foundation of the tyrant's hand. Veskira stumbled, her regal composure finally cracking. Elara's heart raced, but it wasn't from fear. No, it was from the exhilarating truth that surged through her veins. She was powerful. She was not just a nurse. She was something far greater. Veskira, now clearly rattled, took a step back. "You dare," she began, but her words faltered as Elara stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "You took everything from my people," Elara said, her voice low and steady. "But I will take it all back." For a long moment, neither spoke. The tension between them was palpable, thick as the air before a storm. Then, with a sharp breath, Veskira lifted her chin, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "You are a fool, human," she spat. You can never stand against the might of the Zorati Empire. Alara's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. I'm not human, she said softly. Not anymore. With that, the room seemed to settle, the raw energy crackling in the air. The queen's gaze was still fixed on her, but Alara no longer saw a powerful monarch. She saw a fearful, trembling ruler who had just realized she had underestimated the last person she should have. Alara turned away, walking toward the door. The galaxy will soon know the truth, she said, her voice now resolute. And when it does, the Zorati will no longer rule the stars. With that, she left the room, leaving the queen standing in stunned silence behind her. Alara's heart was heavy with the weight of what was to come. But for the first time in her life, she knew who she was. And nothing, not even the mighty Zorati, could stop her now. Alara stood in the dimly lit command room of the tyrant's hand, her fingers lightly grazing the cool surface of the table before her. It was a far cry from the sterile medical bays where she had spent the majority of her time. Now, she was in a room where decisions were made, decisions that shaped the fate of entire civilizations. The room was alive with the low hum of the ship's systems, the glow of holographic displays casting a faint blue light across the faces of those gathered. The Zorati generals, high-ranking officials, and noble emissaries of the Empire stood in silence, their attention fixed on her. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with anticipation. Alara had insisted on this meeting. She had demanded it. It was time to stop hiding behind the veil of ignorance and submit to a future that, while uncertain, was now undeniably hers. The long-lost princess, the last heir to a throne no one remembered, had arrived. The doors slid open, and a tall Zorati noble entered, his regal figure immediately drawing attention. He was one of the few who hadn't left when Alara had made her statement to the queen. High Marshal Veril. His presence was imposing, his long silver hair trailing behind him like a banner of his pride. He studied Alara with an expression that was as unreadable as stone, but his eyes betrayed something more. Curiosity, perhaps. Respect? It was hard to tell. I see you've gathered the most important of our empire's minds, Nurse Vasquez, Veril said, his voice deep and rich with authority. Are you prepared to explain why we should tolerate the charade? Alara's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, the room seemed to fade away. All that remained was her and the marshal. She felt the weight of his gaze, but instead of shrinking under it, she met him head-on. She could feel the power inside her, a raw, pulsating force, and the time for silence was over. This is no charade, Marshal, she said, her voice carrying a strength that was not her own, but was undeniably hers. I am Alara Vasquez, last of the Galathian royal bloodline. And I am not here to explain myself. I am here to take back what was stolen from my people. There was a stir among the assembly, whispers rippling through the room like a wave. Veril's brow furrowed. He wasn't expecting this. He wasn't expecting her to stand so boldly. Most humans would have cowered, but not her. Not Alara. Galathian? Veril's voice was laced with skepticism. You claim to be the last of a race that perished millennia ago. What makes you think your bloodline matters now? The Zorati Empire has crushed countless civilizations. Your people were a footnote in the grand design of the galaxy. Alara took a step forward, her gaze unwavering. You are wrong. You may have wiped my people from the records, but you cannot erase the truth. I am the bloodline that once ruled a galaxy that you now subjugate. My people knew what it meant to lead, to govern with wisdom and compassion. Your empire was built on the broken backs of those you conquered. And I will not let that stand any longer. A murmur spread through the room, but no one spoke. The silence was thick, charged with an energy that mirrored Alara's own. The marshal's eyes narrowed as he processed her words. He stepped closer, his expression hardening. You think you can lead? He asked, his voice growing cold. You are nothing but a human, nothing more than an insignificant speck in the grand scheme of things. Even if you are of Galathian descent, your blood means nothing here. You are no queen. And you are certainly no threat to us. Illyra's heart hammered in her chest. The marshal's words were meant to wound, to diminish her. But she was beyond that now. The power that surged through her veins, the visions of her ancestors, the memories of the empire she had never known, all of it was coming together. She wasn't just a human nurse anymore. She was the heir to a forgotten throne, a ruler of ancient might. "I may be human, but I am no longer just that," Illyra said, her voice low but filled with a force that made even the marshal pause. "I am the last of the Galathians. And I will take my throne." A tense silence filled the room, the air thick with the unspoken realization that Illyra was not playing games. She was not bluffing. She had come here not to seek permission but to reclaim what was rightfully hers. "You think we'll simply bend to your will?" Veril scoffed. "You think that after everything we've done, after everything you've witnessed, we will just hand over power to a mere human? To someone who claims to be royalty?" Illyra's hand trembled at her side, not from fear, but from the anticipation of what was to come. She could feel the energy surging within her, growing stronger with every word. She wasn't just speaking to the marshal anymore. She was speaking to the empire itself, to the forces that had long oppressed her people, to the Zorati who thought they could control everything. She wasn't just a nurse. She wasn't just a forgotten princess. She was a force that couldn't be ignored. "I'm not here to beg for your power," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I'm here to take it." Before anyone could respond, Illyra raised her hand, and the power inside her surged outward. It wasn't a violent blast, but a force that seemed to bend the very fabric of the room. The lights flickered, the temperature in the room dropped, and a faint hum filled the air as her energy expanded. The table beneath her hand rattled, the holographic displays crackling with static as if struggling to contain the power she was unleashing. The assembly watched in stunned silence. Marshal Veril stood rigid, his face a mixture of disbelief and something else, something like fear. It wasn't fear of her power, not yet, but the fear of what she represented. "I don't need your approval," Illyra continued, her voice unwavering. "But make no mistake, I will claim what is mine. You may have the power now, but it won't last. The galaxy will rise again, and when it does, the Zorati will be no more." The room was dead silent now, the weight of her words settling like a storm cloud. She could feel the eyes of every person in the room on her, their disbelief, their skepticism, their fear. She could feel their world beginning to shift. "You have no idea what you're up against," Veril finally spoke, his voice low, but it was no longer filled with mockery. There was something else now, an acknowledgement. "But we will see, won't we? How far you get." Illyra didn't respond. She didn't need to. She had said enough. She had shown them that she wasn't just a human, and she wasn't just a nurse. She was a force that would tear their empire apart. And she would rebuild it in her image. The corridors of the tyrant's hand were quiet, the usual hum of activity dampened by the palpable tension that now hung in the air. Illyra walked with purpose, her footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent ship. She had long shed the uncertainty that had once plagued her. Now, every step she took was in service to a single, unshakable goal, to reclaim her empire. The room she entered was a command center, an elaborate space filled with holographic displays and data streams that showed the vast expanse of the Zorati Empire. It was here that decisions were made, strategies drawn up, and futures decided. The generals of the Zorati army were gathered around, their eyes not on the displays, but on her. Marshal Veril stood at the forefront, his eyes sharp and calculating. "You are truly foolish if you think this will end in anything other than your destruction, Illyra." Illyra met his gaze, her expression unflinching. "You underestimate me, Marshal. It's not your destruction I'm after. It's the freedom of my people." The generals exchanged glances, and the tension in the room thickened. They were not accustomed to being challenged in such a direct manner. Zorati's superiority, once unquestionable, now stood at the precipice of something entirely new. "I'm not here to talk about ideals," Illyra continued, her voice cold and commanding. "The time for words is over. The galaxy will change, whether you like it or not. She turned to the nearest holographic display and manipulated the controls with a single, deliberate motion. The map of the galaxy shifted, zooming in on a small but strategic outpost in the Galathian sector, the birthplace of her ancestors, now under the control of the Zorati. The Vala's Rift, Viral muttered, his voice low, as if the mere name of the place carried weight. You plan to take it back? Ilara's eyes locked onto his, unwavering. It is mine by birthright. And I will take it back. We begin there. Viral looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and disdain. Do you think you can just waltz in and reclaim what was lost? The Zorati fleet is formidable, and that outpost is heavily fortified. You will die before you even get close. You don't know what I'm capable of, Ilara said, her tone cutting through the room like a blade. And you don't know what I've awakened. She moved toward the center of the room, her presence commanding every eye in the space. The generals may have been skeptical of her claim to the throne, but the fear was beginning to show. The uncertainty was creeping in. Ilara wasn't just some human nurse anymore. She wasn't a naive princess. She was a force, a power that could not be contained. We'll need to move quickly, she added, turning back to face them. The longer we wait, the more prepared they'll be. We strike tonight. Viral didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on her. He could feel the shift in the room. The Zorati had ruled with an iron fist for millennia, their empire stretching across the galaxy like a shadow that touched everything. But now, for the first time in a long while, that shadow was being challenged. Prepare the fleet, Ilara ordered, her voice sharp and final. We leave at once. Hours later, the fleet was assembled, a formidable force of ships ready to take on whatever the Zorati would throw at them. Ilara stood at the helm of the lead cruiser, her gaze fixed on the holographic display of the Vala's Rift, now just a few light years away. Her hand rested on the armrest, her fingers twitching with the power she could feel coursing through her. She was ready. This was the moment that would define everything. All systems are ready, Your Highness, a young officer said, his voice steady but betraying a hint of excitement. The fleet is awaiting your orders. Ilara nodded, her eyes still focused on the rift. We go in silent. No transmissions. No signals. We'll move in under the radar, and strike before they even know we're here. A sense of anticipation rippled through the room. The officers were nervous, but they trusted her. Ilara had proven herself time and time again, not just as a leader, but as a symbol of something new. A hope that had been buried for so long. As the fleet approached the outer perimeter of the Vala's Rift, the sensors on Ilara's ship lit up, a sudden surge of activity flooding the control panels. The outpost was ready for them. It wasn't just fortified, it was armed. The Zorati had clearly anticipated some kind of rebellion, but they had no idea it would come from someone like Ilara. Shields up, Ilara ordered, her voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. Prepare for combat. The ship shook as they entered the rift's gravitational pull, the light from the nearby stars bending as they descended into the sector. The tactical display blinked, showing the Zorati ships that guarded the outpost. Ilara's eyes narrowed. On my mark, she said, her words clear and precise. She could feel the power rising within her, the energy that had been building for so long. It was almost as if the very stars were waiting for her to unleash it. Mark. The fleet surged forward, and all at once, the attack began. Ilara's ships launched an assault on the Zorati defenses with brutal efficiency. The Zorati ships tried to retaliate, but the precision of the human fleet, guided by Ilara's strategy and her newfound power, was overwhelming. It wasn't just the firepower or the ships, they fought with a purpose, with a unity that the Zorati had never seen from humans. Ilara's ship fired first, a concentrated burst of energy that struck the Zorati's shield and sent shockwaves through their fleet. The Zorati commanders scrambled, their plans unraveling as they attempted to regroup. But Ilara was already one step ahead, anticipating every move. She could feel the battle unfolding within her, as though her power was tied to the very fate of the engagement. The battle raged for hours, but as the Zorati forces finally began to retreat, Ilara stood victorious. The Vala's rift was hers again. The fleet's victory wasn't just a military achievement, it was symbolic. It was the first strike in a war that would challenge the very foundations of the Zorati Empire. "Ilera," Varel said over the comms, his voice a mixture of respect and grudging acknowledgement. "You've done it. The rift is yours." Ilera looked out at the wreckage of the Zorati fleet, her expression unreadable. "This is only the beginning," she said softly. "Now, we take back the galaxy." As the ship sailed through the remnants of the battle, Ilera knew that this was just the start of something much bigger. She had shown them that the Zorati were no longer untouchable. The galaxy would change, and she would be the one to make it happen. ChatGPT can make mistakes. The Tyrant's Hand was a ship that had once commanded respect, its name whispered in fear across the galaxy. Now, it felt different under Ilera's command. The halls that had once been filled with arrogance were now alive with purpose. Her fleet had grown, and so had her confidence. The first victory at the Vala's Rift had set the stage, but Ilera knew this was just the beginning. She needed to strike at the heart of the Zorati Empire, their capital, their seat of power, the place where their endless reign had begun. The long nights of planning had taken their toll on her. But every time she closed her eyes, the visions came, her people, the Galathians, their grandeur in their fall, their legacy. They had once ruled not through fear, but through unity and wisdom. Ilera had the potential to restore that balance, to bring the galaxy back into equilibrium. She stood on the bridge of her flagship, gazing out at the expanse of stars before her. The capital of the Zorati Empire, Zyrith Prime, loomed in the distance, a massive world of towering cities, high-tech defense systems, and a civilization that believed itself invincible. The planet was a fortress, its very atmosphere thick with Zorati power. The Empire had been built on this foundation, and Ilera knew that dismantling it would take more than just military might. She would need to exploit its weaknesses, the cracks that ran deep within the Zorati psyche. "All systems are green, Your Highness," Captain Jin reported from his station. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of nervous energy that lingered in the air. They all knew what was at stake. "We are ready to begin the assault on Zyrith Prime," Jin added, his eyes flicking to the tactical screen. "But the defenses are formidable." Ilera nodded. She had already expected this. "I know," she said, her voice low but resolute. "But we strike now, before they can regroup." The crew aboard the Tyrant's Hand had changed. What was once a group of unwilling, disillusioned soldiers had transformed into a unified force. They followed her because they believed in the cause, because they believed in her. There was no turning back now. "Launch the fleet," Ilera ordered, her voice carrying authority. "And signal all units, we make for Zyrith Prime." The journey to Zyrith Prime was long, but it passed in relative silence. The tension hung in the air like a storm cloud, each passing hour drawing them closer to the heart of the Empire. As they approached, Ilera stood at the observation deck, watching the planet grow larger on the view screen. Her heart pounded, but it was not fear that gripped her. It was resolve. This was her destiny. This was what she had fought for. "Your Highness," Captain Jin's voice broke through her thoughts. "We're entering the outer perimeter. We have Zorati ships closing in." Ilera turned and walked back toward the command center. Her eyes narrowed as she studied the tactical map on the display. A wave of Zorati warships was already engaging her fleet, their firepower intense. It was to be expected. The Zorati were not going to let this attack happen without a fight. "Prepare to engage," Ilera said coolly. "Hold nothing back." The battle that ensued was unlike any Ilera had experienced. The Zorati were relentless, throwing everything they had at her fleet. Their ships were massive, armed with weapons that could obliterate an entire battalion with a single shot. But Ilera's forces were swift, agile, and coordinated. They fought not with sheer strength, but with precision. The Zorati could not anticipate them, could not predict their movements. Ilera had learned from her first victory. The key to taking down the Empire was not to fight them head-on, but to outsmart them. "Enemy shields are down," Jin reported, his voice tinged with excitement. We have a clear shot at their flagship. Take it, Alara ordered, her voice unwavering. The fleet surged forward, firing a barrage of missiles and energy blasts that tore through the Zora T defenses. The flagship, a gargantuan vessel, cracked under the pressure. Alara could feel the momentum building, the tide turning in their favor. But this was only the beginning. The heart of the Empire was still within reach. As the dust settled from the battle, Alara's ship moved closer to the planet's surface. The capital city of Zyrith Prime loomed before her, a sprawling metropolis that was a symbol of the Zorati's dominance. The city was built with towering spires, intricate defense systems, and shields that made the atmosphere shimmer in a soft, green glow. The Zorati believed their capital was impenetrable. But Alara had something they didn't, knowledge of the Zorati's weaknesses. Her fleet descended into the atmosphere, targeting strategic points across the city's infrastructure. Power plants, shield generators, communication hubs, each was disabled with precision strikes. The Zorati tried to respond, but Alara's forces were already in position, moving swiftly through the city's underbelly. The battle on the surface was fierce, but it was nothing compared to the one that awaited them at the heart of Zyrith Prime. Alara's command ship landed in the center of the capital, its landing gear scraping against the metallic ground. The doors opened, and she stepped out, flanked by her most trusted commanders. The air was thick with tension, the stillness of the city in stark contrast to the chaos of the battle above. Stay sharp, Alara said quietly, her eyes scanning the surroundings. We're heading to the central palace. The Zorati Council will be there. Take them out. The group moved quickly, slipping through the corridors of the palace, their weapons ready. The Zorati had underestimated her. They thought they could simply intimidate her with their advanced technology and their centuries of dominance. But Alara was not afraid. Inside the palace, the Zorati council members were gathered in the throne room, a massive chamber with high ceilings and cold, white marble floors. They were standing in a circle, speaking in hushed tones, when Alara and her forces entered. The council members froze, their faces pale as they turned to face the woman who had shattered their empire's defenses. Alara's eyes locked onto the central figure, the leader of the council, a woman whose face was as cold as stone. You should not have underestimated me, Alara said, her voice unwavering. The council leader's eyes flickered with something, fear, perhaps, or realization. You cannot rule, she said, her voice trembling slightly. You are nothing more than a relic of a dead race. Alara's gaze hardened. A relic? No. I am the future. And you are the past. With a single motion, Alara raised her hand, the power within her surging. The room shook as the energy in the air thickened, the remnants of a long-forgotten empire now being wielded by its last descendant. You will fall, Alara declared, her voice a promise. The Zorati Council stood frozen, the weight of their inevitable defeat settling over them like a shroud. And as Alara raised her hand, the power that had long lain dormant within her surged. At that moment, she knew the galaxy had already begun to change. The Zorati Empire would fall. And her reign would rise. The throne room of Zyrith Prime had been reduced to a shadow of its former grandeur. The once pristine marble floors were now scorched with the aftermath of battle, the air thick with the scent of burning metal. Alara stood before the Zorati Council, the room heavy with silence as her power rippled outward, contained just beneath the surface. The council members, those who had once ruled the Zorati Empire with arrogance and disdain, now knelt before her, victims of their own hubris. Their once imposing figures, draped in gold and silver, now seemed small and fragile in the face of her newfound strength. Is this your idea of ruling? One of the counselors sneered, his voice a mix of defiance and fear. His once pristine robes were singed at the edges, his face bruised from the earlier chaos. You are nothing but a barbarian, using force to claim power that doesn't belong to you. Alara's eyes narrowed, the pulse of her latent energy growing stronger as her anger flared. But she kept her voice steady, each word measured and controlled. No, she said softly. This empire doesn't belong to you. It never did. The council leader, a woman whose icy demeanor had long since crumbled, stepped forward, her eyes flickering with both fear and something else, understanding, perhaps. You may have won, Ilera, but victory comes with a price. Do you think this galaxy will simply fall in line behind you because you claim to be the last of the Galathians? The Zora-T will never yield. Ilera's gaze hardened as she looked down at the defeated council, her mind turning. She had done what she set out to do, defeat the Zora-T, break their hold on the galaxy. But as she stood there, her hands shaking with the weight of the power surging inside her, she realized something crucial. This wasn't just about taking control, it was about holding it. And that required more than just military victories, it required trust, strategy, and a deep understanding of what the Empire was built upon. You misunderstand, Ilera replied, her voice growing colder. I'm not just claiming the throne because of my bloodline. I'm here because this galaxy deserves something more than the tyranny you've imposed for centuries. You are right about one thing, victory has a price. But the price is not just mine to pay. It's the galaxy's. The council fell silent, their expressions mixed with disbelief and uncertainty. They had believed themselves invincible, but now they were at her mercy. And Ilera could feel that same sense of unease building inside her as she considered the task ahead. The destruction of the Zora-T Empire was only one part of the equation. The real question was what she would build in its place. The leader of the council, an older Zora-T woman with gray eyes that gleamed with a mixture of wisdom and exhaustion, took a deep breath before speaking again. You think you can change this, Ilera. But even you can't erase centuries of history. The Zora-T will rise again, no matter how many of us you destroy. Ilera shook her head, stepping forward with a sense of finality. The Zora-T may rise again, but it won't be as rulers of the galaxy. You've had your chance. Now, it's time for something new. She felt a shift within her, the power of her Galathian heritage surging like a tidal wave. With a deep breath, she raised her hand, sending a pulse of energy through the room. The air vibrated with the force of it, and the council members flinched, as if they could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Consider this the first step toward a new galaxy, Ilera said, her voice steady. One where no species, no empire, holds dominion over another. As the room trembled under her command, the council members fell silent, no longer daring to challenge her. But Ilera's mind was already elsewhere. She had won, yes, but the cost of victory was more than just the life of the Zora-T rulers. It was the weight of the responsibility she had taken upon herself. Marshal Veril, Ilera called, her eyes scanning the room. The marshal had been conspicuously absent from the final confrontation with the council, but Ilera knew he had not been far. His loyalty was a double-edged sword, he had been her ally in this war, but his ambition was not to be underestimated. It would only be a matter of time before he sought to stake his claim. Veril appeared at the doorway, his face hard and unreadable. His uniform was tattered, his eyes dark with fatigue, but there was a glimmer of something else in them, something that might have been respect, or maybe even fear. I'm here, Your Highness, he said, his voice quiet. Ilera studied him, her eyes calculating. She had made her first move, but there were still players on the board, and some of them were just as dangerous as the Zora-T had been. Veril was one of them, and she couldn't afford to ignore him. I need you to prepare the fleet for a new mission, Ilera said, her voice firm. We've crippled the Zora-T, but the galaxy is still divided. We need to unite the sectors, restore order, and ensure that the power we've gained isn't squandered. Veril's gaze lingered on her, his lips pressed into a thin line. He had served the Zora-T Empire for years, and now he was expected to serve her. She knew he was calculating, wondering if he had any place in the new order she was creating. And what of the council? Veril asked, his voice low. What should we do with them? Ilera paused for a moment, considering her words carefully. She could feel the weight of their lives in her hands, but she knew that mercy had its limits. The Zora-T had caused too much suffering, too much destruction to let them simply walk away. But execution? It didn't sit right with her. They are prisoners, not trophies, she said finally, her voice cold but resolute. They will be held accountable for their crimes, but I won't stoop to their level. We will rebuild, but we must do so with justice, not vengeance. Veril nodded, though there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Understood, Your Highness. As he left to carry out her orders, Elara turned back to the throne. It was hers now, but it felt heavy, the weight of her decisions pressing down on her shoulders. She had fought to claim this power, but what came next was far more daunting than any battle she had faced. The galaxy was changing. But change came with its own price. And Elara wasn't sure if she was ready to pay it. You said.